My name is Lloyd Vale, and the night they destroyed me started like any other family dinner. The chandelier cast warm light over the mahogany table, expensive wine flowed freely, and my family gathered to celebrate another successful quarter for Vale Industries. I sat in my usual spot, 3 seats down from my father, 2 seats away from relevance. I didn't know that in 2 hours I'd lose my job, my wife, and any illusion that blood meant loyalty. But I also didn't know that they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. You see, while they were firing me for being a disappointment, I was quietly holding the keys to a $47 million empire they didn't even know existed. While my wife was walking out with her new lover, calling me a failure, I was sitting on patents that would make their family business obsolete within 6 months. Now I wonder, if they'd known who I really was that night, would they have dared to destroy me? Or were they always going to betray me regardless of the consequences? This is the story of how silence became my sharpest weapon, and how my own family couldn't escape what came next when I finally stopped hiding who I was. For 15 years, I had been the Vale family's greatest disappointment. At least that's what they believed. While my brother Austin built his reputation as the golden child of Vale Industries, closing million-dollar real estate deals and charming investors at charity galas, I worked quietly in the background as a junior systems analyst, a title that made me sound like an overpaid IT support technician. What they didn't know was that I'd been using my position to build something far more valuable than Austin's flashy real estate portfolio. Every database I optimized, every system I streamlined, every process I automated for Vale Industries became the foundation for something bigger. I wasn't just fixing their technology, I was learning how entire industries operated from the inside out. My wife Janet saw only what she wanted to see, a husband who wore off-the-rack suits while her friends' husbands wore custom Italian wool. A man who drove a 3-year-old sedan while her social circle arrived at events in luxury cars that cost more than most people's homes. A provider who could afford a comfortable life but not the extravagant lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to before our marriage. "Lloyd, honestly," she'd said just last month while getting ready for Austin's promotion celebration, "couldn't you at least try to look like you belong in this family? Your father built an empire, your brother is expanding it, and what exactly are you contributing?" I could have told her about the 3 separate technology companies I'd incorporated under different names. I could have mentioned the machine learning algorithms I'd developed that were revolutionizing how smaller businesses managed their operations. I could have shown her the bank statements that proved my side projects generated more profit than Austin's entire real estate division. Instead, I helped her zip up her dress and drove her to the party in my unremarkable sedan. The Vale family dynamic had crystallized over decades of carefully maintained fiction. My father, Sterling Vale, had built his reputation on the illusion of diversified success: real estate, hospitality, some light manufacturing. What held it all together, what made the technology actually work, what kept the databases running and the communications flowing, was me. But because I worked behind the scenes and preferred to let others take credit for smooth operations, my contributions were invisible. Austin thrived on visibility. He was the face of expansion, the charm offensive that landed new clients, the confident handshake that closed deals. What he couldn't do, what none of them could do, was understand how the machinery of modern business actually functioned. They lived in a world of relationships and impressions, while I lived in a world of systems and solutions. My grandfather, Augustus Vale, had understood this distinction before he passed 3 years ago. During one of our last conversations, he'd pulled me aside at a family gathering. "Lloyd," he'd said quietly, "show business and real business are 2 different things. Your father and brother are excellent at show business. But real business, the kind that lasts, requires people who understand how things actually work." He paused, studying my face. "I've left some protections in place. Legal structures you might find useful someday. When people mistake your competence for compliance, they make dangerous assumptions." I hadn't fully understood what he meant at the time. I was about to find out. The signs of my family's growing dismissal had been subtle but consistent. Strategy meetings that happened without me. Client presentations where my technical contributions were credited to the IT team in generic terms. Bonus distributions that somehow reflected my supporting role, rather than the fact that nothing in their business functioned without my invisible contributions. But the most telling sign was how they talked about the future. When they discussed succession planning, expansion strategies, or long-term vision, they spoke as if I were temporary staff rather than family. A useful resource that could be replaced when necessary. 3 months before that final dinner, I'd overheard a conversation between my father and Austin that crystallized everything. They were in Sterling's office, door slightly ajar, discussing a potential merger with a larger firm. The technology transition would be the tricky part, Austin was saying. We'd need to make sure all our systems integrate smoothly. Lloyd handles all that, Sterling replied dismissively. He can train their IT team and then we won't need to maintain redundant staff. Train their IT team. As if 15 years of building and maintaining their entire technological infrastructure was knowledge I could pass along in a few training sessions. Good, Austin said. Honestly, it might be time for Lloyd to explore opportunities elsewhere anyway. He's never really seemed happy here, and this could be a natural transition point. A natural transition point. They were planning to eliminate my position without even telling me, while continuing to benefit from everything I'd built for them. That night, I went home and made a decision that would change everything. I stopped hiding my parallel empire. For 5 years, I'd been developing and licensing proprietary software through a company called Axiom Solutions. The name was deliberately generic, the ownership structure deliberately opaque. Client companies used my systems to optimize their operations, but they thought they were working with a team of analysts rather than a single developer who happened to share their last name with a competing firm. Axiom's client list was impressive: 3 major hospital networks that relied on my patient flow optimization systems, 2 manufacturing companies that had doubled their efficiency using my inventory management algorithms, and a logistics firm that had revolutionized their delivery routing with software I'd designed. But the crown jewel of my hidden empire was something I called the integration protocol, a comprehensive system that allowed disparate business technologies to communicate seamlessly. It was exactly what every growing company needed in an increasingly digital economy, and it was exactly what Vail Industries would need to complete their planned merger. The irony was perfect. They were planning to eliminate me while unknowingly depending on technology that only I could provide. The night of that final family dinner, I sat quietly at the table, watching Austin regale everyone with stories of his latest deal, listening to Janet charm the relatives with her social grace, and observing my father's satisfaction with his successful children. I knew what was coming. I'd seen the legal documents on Sterling's desk, noticed the subtle changes in how they discussed future plans, felt the shift in how they treated my opinions and contributions. They were going to cut me loose. What they didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for longer than they'd been planning it. While they were focused on show business, I'd been building real business. While they were managing relationships, I'd been creating systems. And while they thought they were discarding their greatest weakness, they were actually about to lose their most valuable asset. The axe fell during dessert, which felt like a deliberate cruelty. We just finished Sterling's favorite meal, herb-crusted lamb with rosemary potatoes, and Janet was laughing at one of Austin's stories about outwitting a competitor for a prime development site. The dining room felt warm and familial, exactly the kind of atmosphere that made what happened next feel like a calculated ambush. My father, Sterling Vail, tapped his wine glass with his knife, calling for attention. Before we finished the evening, he announced, "I have some business to discuss." The table quieted. Janet straightened beside me, probably expecting another announcement about company growth or Austin's promotion. My father's expression was serious but not unkind, the look of a man about to make a difficult but necessary decision. "Lloyd," he said, turning toward me with practiced authority, "the board met yesterday to discuss organizational restructuring. We've decided that your position is being eliminated effective immediately." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. I felt the eyes of everyone at the table, my mother, my uncle, my cousins, all watching to see how I would react to being professionally executed at a family dinner. "The company is evolving," Sterling continued, his voice taking on the tone he used for shareholder meetings. "We need to focus on core competencies and eliminate redundancies. Your role has become superfluous." Superfluous? 15 years of building their technological infrastructure and I was superfluous. Austin leaned forward with what he probably thought was sympathetic professionalism. "We'll provide a generous severance package, of course. And I'm sure you'll find opportunities elsewhere that better match your skill set." Better match my skill set. As if they had any idea what my actual skills were. I should have felt angry. I should have defended myself, listed my contributions, demanded recognition for everything I'd built for them. Instead, I felt something colder and more clarifying, the crystal clear understanding that they had just made a catastrophic mistake. "I see," I said quietly, setting down my fork. "Thank you for letting me know." The calm in my voice seemed to surprise them. They'd probably expected protest, maybe even an emotional breakdown. My mother looked almost disappointed that I wasn't providing more drama for their evening. That's when Janet chose her moment. She stood from her chair with fluid grace, reaching into her purse to pull out a manila envelope that looked suspiciously legal. "Since we're sharing news," she said, her voice bright with the confidence of someone who'd been planning this moment, "I have an announcement too." She placed the envelope on the table in front of me with theatrical precision. "Divorce papers," she said simply. "I've already signed them." The table went silent in a way that felt different from the professional quiet that had followed my termination. This was personal betrayal, messier and more entertaining for the audience. "I'm leaving tonight," she continued, and her voice carried none of the warmth I'd heard from her for the past 7 years. "With someone who actually has a future." She gestured toward the dining room entrance, where a man I recognized was now standing. Trevor Hastings, real estate developer, country club member, owner of the kind of flashy lifestyle Janet had always craved. He gave me a small nod that might have been apologetic if it wasn't so smug. "You've always been a disappointment, Lloyd," Janet said, her voice carrying the venom of years of accumulated frustration. "At least now it's official." Austin actually chuckled, a sound that cut through the room like breaking glass. The rest of the family watched with the fascination people reserve for train wrecks in reality TV. I looked around the table at these people I'd called family, these people I'd quietly supported and enabled for 15 years, these people who were now watching my professional and personal destruction like it was dinner theater. And I smiled. Not a bitter smile or a broken smile, but the calm, knowing smile of someone who had just been handed exactly the opportunity they'd been waiting for. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my key ring, the modest collection of keys that included my house key, my car key, and 2 others that no one at this table would recognize. One opened a beachfront property in Cape Cod that was registered to a trust they'd never heard of. The other opened an office building in downtown Boston where Axiom Solutions occupied the entire 4th floor. "Thank you," I said, standing slowly and deliberately, for the clarity. I looked at each of them, Sterling with his satisfied authority, Austin with his smug superiority, Janet with her confident cruelty, my mother with her disappointed resignation. "You won't hear from me again," I said quietly. And I walked out. I drove home in complete silence, no radio, no phone calls, just the sound of rain beginning to tap against the windshield. By the time I pulled into my driveway, it was a full downpour, the kind of storm that washes everything clean. Inside my house, I went straight to my home office. It was a modest room with standard furniture, nothing that would indicate the scope of what I managed from this space. I opened my laptop and began the process I'd rehearsed in my mind dozens of times but never executed. First, I changed all passwords for every Axiom Solutions system. Then I activated the automatic notice protocols that would inform our clients about leadership transitions affecting their service contracts. Finally, I accessed the integration protocol that Vail Industries had been using without realizing it was mine. The beauty of having built their technological infrastructure was that I understood exactly how dependent they were on systems they didn't even know they were using. Automated processes that would stop functioning. Database synchronizations that would fail. Communication protocols that would simply stop. I wouldn't sabotage anything, I wasn't interested in destruction. I would simply stop providing services they didn't know they were receiving. By morning, Austin would discover that the seamless integration he'd been promising investors was entirely dependent on software licensing agreements that had just expired. Sterling would learn that the efficiency metrics he'd been bragging about to shareholders were generated by systems that no longer functioned. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, I had a different destination. I packed a single bag with essentials, grabbed the folder of documents I'd kept in my desk drawer for years, and drove 2 hours north through the storm to a place none of them knew existed. The Cape Cod house sat on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, weathered cedar shingles and wide windows that faced the endless horizon. I'd bought it 5 years ago through a trust fund my grandfather had helped me establish, a quiet retreat where I could think and plan without the noise of family expectations. As I stood on the deck watching waves crash against the rocks below, I realized that everything had changed. Not just because of what they'd done to me, but because of what they'd revealed about themselves. They thought they'd discarded their biggest liability. They'd actually just lost their most valuable asset. And unlike them, I was about to show them exactly what real business looked like. The Cape Cod house became my command center, though it looked nothing like the war room it had become. The main living area was open and minimal white walls, comfortable furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that made the Atlantic feel like part of the room. But the second bedroom had been converted into an office that would have impressed any Fortune 500 CEO. 3 monitors displayed real-time data from Axiom Solutions client networks. A secure phone line connected me directly to my attorney, Rebecca Ross, who specialized in corporate restructuring and had been quietly managing my business interests for 6 years. File cabinets contained documentation of every system I'd built, every license I'd granted, and every legal protection my grandfather had put in place. The first 48 hours after my exile were dedicated to understanding the full scope of what I controlled versus what my family thought they owned. The results were more devastating than I'd anticipated. Vale Industries' entire customer relationship management system was built on Axiom Solutions software. Their inventory tracking, their financial reporting, their communications protocols, all of it licensed through agreements that automatically terminated when I was no longer employed by the company. Sterling and Austin had unknowingly created a technological house of cards with me as the foundation. But the real revelation came when I accessed my grandfather's sealed documents. Rebecca arrived on my second morning with a briefcase full of legal papers that Augustus Vale had left in her care with instructions to deliver them only after Lloyd's inevitable separation from the family business. "Your grandfather was remarkably prescient," Rebecca said as she spread the documents across my dining table. "He predicted this scenario almost exactly." The papers revealed a web of legal protections I'd never known existed. Augustus had restructured the family business's founding documents to include what he called competency clauses, provisions that automatically transferred controlling interest to family members who demonstrated both technical expertise and ethical leadership if other shareholders acted against the company's long-term interests. More importantly, he documented my contributions to Vale Industries in ways that established legal ownership of innovations I developed while employed there. Patents filed in my name, intellectual property registrations, software copyrights, all of it properly attributed and legally protected. "Essentially," Rebecca explained, "your grandfather made you the technical owner of most of the systems that keep Vale Industries functional. Your father and brother have been operating a business they don't actually control." The third piece of Augustus's strategy was the most elegant. He'd established a trust fund in my name that held minority stakes in 17 different companies, including 3 of Vale Industries' largest competitors. If I chose to activate my role as a shareholder, I could influence market conditions that would affect my family's business. "He was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers," I murmured, studying the documents. "The question now," Rebecca said, "is how you want to use this leverage." That evening, I stood on my deck watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and red. For the first time in my adult life, I had complete clarity about my position and my options. I wasn't a discarded family member plotting revenge. I was a business owner who had just discovered the full extent of his assets. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, I found a message from an old colleague at Vale Industries. "Lloyd, things are falling apart here. Austin's going crazy trying to figure out why the integration systems crashed. Your father's demanding answers no one can provide. They're talking about hiring outside consultants to fix what you built. Thought you should know." I deleted the message without responding, but it confirmed what I'd expected. They were discovering that their superfluous employee had been the central nervous system of their entire operation. Over the next week, I received similar messages from 3 other Vale Industries employees. Stories of panicked meetings, crashed databases, failed communications with clients. Austin had apparently told the staff that they were experiencing routine technical difficulties that would be resolved quickly. But I knew better. The integration protocol wasn't just software, it was a comprehensive approach to business systems that I'd developed over 15 years. Replacing it would require not just new software, but a complete understanding of how modern businesses actually functioned at the technological level. Understanding they didn't possess. During my second week at the Cape House, Rebecca called with an update that confirmed my family's growing desperation. "They've hired Pinnacle Strategic Solutions," she reported. "Top-tier corporate troubleshooters. They're paying premium rates for emergency systems analysis." I'd heard of Pinnacle. They were the consultants companies called when they needed to reverse engineer complex technological problems they couldn't solve internally. Good people, but they were about to discover that some systems can't be replicated without understanding the foundational thinking that created them. "How long do you think it will take them to realize the scope of the problem?" I asked. "Based on what you've shown me about the system architecture? Pinnacle will spend 3 weeks just mapping the existing infrastructure. Another month trying to rebuild it. And they'll probably recommend a complete overhaul that would take 6 months and cost more than Vale Industries' annual profit. 6 months during which my family's business would be hemorrhaging money, losing clients, and watching their reputation crumble in real time." "There's something else," Rebecca added. "Sterling's been making calls to corporate attorneys. I think they're planning to claim ownership of Axiom Solutions' intellectual property. I smiled, looking out at the waves rolling steadily toward shore. Let them try. Augustus was very thorough about establishing independent ownership. That night, I made a decision about the timeline for my return. Not because I was eager for confrontation, but because I was ready to stop hiding who I really was. They'd spent 15 years assuming that quiet meant weak, that technical meant subservient, that working behind the scenes meant being less important than working in the spotlight. They were about to learn how expensive those assumptions could be. But first, I had one more investigation to complete, understanding exactly how deep their ethical compromises went. Because if I was going to take control of Vale Industries, I needed to know everything I'd be inheriting. What I discovered in public records, employee complaints, and regulatory filings made me realize that saving the family business might require destroying the family's reputation. And I was finally ready to do both. 3 weeks after my exile, the first crack in Vale Industries' facade appeared in the local business journal. The headline was modest: "Local development firm experiences technical delays." But I knew it was the beginning of an avalanche. The article quoted Austin explaining that routine system upgrades were causing temporary inconveniences for clients, but that operations would return to normal soon. What he didn't mention was that 3 major clients had already missed critical project deadlines because their development management systems had simply stopped functioning. I was monitoring the situation from my Cape Cod office, tracking news coverage, client communications, and stock movements through a combination of public information and insights from my remaining contacts within the company. What I saw was exactly what I'd predicted: a controlled collapse disguised as temporary technical difficulties. Rebecca arrived that morning with updates that confirmed my family's growing panic. Pinnacle Strategic Solutions submitted their preliminary report, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. They've identified the problem. Vale Industries is entirely dependent on proprietary software that they don't own, can't replicate, and can't replace without essentially rebuilding their entire business model. Estimated cost for replacement? $12 million and 18 months of development time. Assuming they can find developers capable of recreating systems that took you 15 years to build. $12 million they didn't have, for a timeline that would bankrupt them long before completion. Sterling's response? Rebecca smiled grimly. He's demanding that Pinnacle find a faster, cheaper solution. Apparently, he believes all technical problems can be solved by throwing money at them and demanding results. I turned to look out at the ocean, where a storm was building on the horizon, dark clouds advancing steadily toward shore. What about the ownership claims? They filed papers yesterday claiming that any software developed by company employees belongs to Vale Industries. They're demanding access to Axiom Solutions source code and client lists. And our response? Rebecca placed a thick folder on my desk. Augustus really was remarkable. Every piece of software you developed has clear documentation showing independent creation, separate copyright filings, and patents registered in your name alone. Their claim is legally worthless. But I knew Sterling well enough to know that legal reality wouldn't stop him from pursuing every possible avenue. Desperate men make increasingly irrational decisions, and I was counting on that desperation to drive him toward choices that would expose the deeper problems in his business. That afternoon, I received a call from an unexpected source: Trevor Hastings, Janet's new partner and my replacement in her life. "Lloyd, I hope you don't mind me calling directly," he said, his voice carrying the nervous confidence of someone who wasn't sure of his reception. "I wanted to discuss a business opportunity." "I'm listening." Vale Industries is in a difficult position right now. Technical problems, client concerns, some financial pressures. As you probably know, I've been expanding my development portfolio, and I think there might be opportunities for collaboration. Translation: he'd learned enough about Vale Industries' problems to see them as vulnerable, and he wanted to use his connection to me to gain an advantage in acquiring their assets at distressed prices. "What kind of collaboration?" I asked. "If you were willing to provide technical consulting, maybe help resolve some of their current systems issues, I could structure a deal that would benefit everyone. Sterling keeps his business, I get some prime development properties, and you get compensated for your expertise." It was exactly the kind of opportunistic maneuvering I'd expected from Janet's new world. Use personal connections to gain business advantages, treat relationships as transactions, assume that everyone could be bought if you structured the deal correctly. "That's an interesting proposal," I said. "Let me think about it." "Of course. But Lloyd, you should know, time is a factor here. From what I'm hearing, Vale Industries might not survive much longer without a resolution to their technical problems." After hanging up, I sat quietly for a few minutes, considering the implications. Trevor's call meant that word of Vale Industries' vulnerability was spreading beyond their immediate business circle. Other developers would soon be circling, looking for opportunities to acquire distressed assets. More importantly, it meant that Janet was still connected enough to my family's situation to influence Trevor's business decisions. She was probably hoping that her new relationship would somehow benefit from my family's crisis. The irony was perfect. She'd left me for someone she thought was more successful, and now that someone wanted to use their relationship with me to profit from my family's destruction. That evening, Rebecca called with news that changed the timeline of everything. "Sterling's filed for emergency court orders," she said. "He's claiming that you're deliberately sabotaging Vale Industries by withholding access to essential business systems. He wants a judge to force you to provide technical support until they can develop replacement systems." "On what legal basis?" "He's arguing that you have a fiduciary duty to the family business that supersedes your employment termination. Essentially, he's claiming that family obligation trumps business law." I leaned back in my chair, watching lightning flicker in the storm clouds approaching from the Atlantic. "And the court's response?" "Hearing scheduled for next Friday. Sterling's pushing for an expedited ruling because of the alleged emergency nature of the situation." "Perfect," I said. "That gives us exactly the public forum we need." Because Sterling had just made his biggest mistake yet. By taking this dispute to court, he was about to create a public record of everything he'd been trying to hide. And once those records were public, other interested parties would have access to information that would make Vale Industries' situation far worse than technical difficulties. "Rebecca, I need you to prepare a complete response package. Every patent filing, every copyright registration, every piece of documentation showing independent ownership of Axiom Solutions. And I want a forensic analysis of Vale Industries' financial records for the past 5 years. Looking for anything specific? Everything Augustus suspected but never proved. If we're going to court, I want the complete picture of what Sterling and Austin have been doing while I was quietly keeping their business functional. What I discovered in those financial records was worse than family betrayal or business incompetence. It was systematic fraud, regulatory violations, and ethical breaches that went back years. They hadn't just been dismissing my contributions, they'd been using my systems to hide their crimes. And now they were about to discover that their cleanup crew had quit. The courthouse was busier than I'd expected for a Friday morning hearing, but then Sterling had always been skilled at generating attention when it served his purposes. I arrived 30 minutes early and watched through the windows as my family gathered on the front steps, Sterling in his most authoritative suit, Austin projecting confident support, my mother offering the kind of concerned family presence that played well for any photographers. What they didn't know was that 3 reporters were already inside, alerted by Rebecca to what she described as a significant corporate governance dispute with broader implications for family business structures. She'd been careful not to oversell the story, but she'd provided enough context to ensure that what happened in that courtroom wouldn't stay private. I entered through a side door, avoiding the family tableau, and took my seat with Rebecca at the defendant's table. Sterling's legal team filled half the courtroom, 4 attorneys from the most expensive firm in the city, along with 2 consultants and a paralegal. They looked like an army prepared for war. Rebecca carried a single briefcase. When Judge Morrison called the case, Sterling's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Douglas Whitmore, stood with theatrical authority. "Your Honor, this is a case about family obligation and business continuity," he began. The plaintiff, Sterling Vale, built a successful company over 30 years, employing his son Lloyd in a technical capacity. When that employment was terminated due to performance issues, the defendant has retaliated by withholding access to business-critical systems, effectively holding the company hostage. Performance issues. I glanced at Rebecca, who made a note but showed no reaction. "The defendant has deliberately sabotaged systems he was paid to maintain," Whitmore continued, "causing significant financial harm to the plaintiff's business and threatening the livelihoods of dozens of employees. We're asking the court to order immediate restoration of system access and to enjoin the defendant from further interference with legitimate business operations." Judge Morrison looked toward our table. "Ms. Ross, your response?" Rebecca stood with calm precision. "Your Honor, this case is not about family obligation. It's about intellectual property rights, independent business ownership, and an attempt to use family courts to resolve commercial disputes that belong in federal court." She opened her briefcase and removed a stack of documents that looked modest compared to Whitmore's elaborate presentation materials. "The defendant, Lloyd Vale, is the sole owner of Axiom Solutions, a software development company that has been licensing systems to Vale Industries under standard commercial agreements. When Mr. Vale's employment was terminated, those licensing agreements expired according to their natural terms. There has been no sabotage, no retaliation, simply the normal conclusion of business relationships. Judge Morrison accepted the documents Rebecca offered. These are the licensing agreements? Yes, Your Honor. Along with patent filings, copyright registrations, and corporate formation documents showing that Axiom Solutions is entirely separate from Vale Industries. The plaintiff is essentially asking this court to force one independent business to provide free services to another independent business. That's when Whitmore made his fatal error. Instead of focusing on the contract law issues Rebecca had raised, he decided to make this personal. Your Honor, the defendant is hiding behind legal technicalities to avoid his moral obligation to his family. This is a son destroying his father's life's work out of spite. I watched Judge Morrison's expression shift slightly. She was a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for focusing on law rather than emotion, and Whitmore had just handed her exactly the kind of manipulative appeal she was known to reject. Mr. Whitmore, she said coolly, this court doesn't adjudicate moral obligations between family members. If you have legal grounds for your claims, please present them. Whitmore fumbled for a moment, then pulled out what was clearly a backup argument. The defendant developed these systems while employed by Vale Industries, using company resources and company time. They belong to the company regardless of how the paperwork was filed. Rebecca stood again. Your Honor, may I present additional documentation? She handed the judge a folder I recognized, the one containing Augustus's meticulously prepared evidence of my independent work. These documents show that Mr. Vale developed his software using personal equipment, during non-work hours with no company resources whatsoever. More importantly, they show that he filed patents and copyrights in his own name, with full disclosure to company leadership, over a period of 15 years. Vale Industries has been licensing this technology, not owning it. Judge Morrison spent several minutes reviewing the documents while the courtroom sat in absolute silence. Finally, she looked up. Mr. Whitmore, do you have any evidence that your client owns the intellectual property in question? The company has been using these systems for years. Surely that establishes some form of ownership or at least dependency. Dependency is not ownership, counselor. And usage under a licensing agreement actually supports the defendant's position that this is independent intellectual property. That's when Rebecca played her final card. Your Honor, there's one more issue the court should consider. Our investigation of Vale Industries' financial records, conducted as part of our defense preparation, has revealed several potential regulatory violations that may explain the plaintiff's desperate attempt to maintain control of Mr. Vale's systems. She handed the judge another folder, the one containing the evidence of Sterling and Austin's questionable business practices. These appear to be violations of EPA regulations, labor law violations, and possible securities fraud. Mr. Vale's systems have been generating the automated reports that concealed these violations from regulatory authorities. The plaintiff may be seeking continued access not for legitimate business purposes, but to continue hiding evidence of criminal activity. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Sterling's face had gone pale, and Austin was staring at his hands like he wanted to disappear. Even their expensive legal team looked shocked. Judge Morrison reviewed the new documents for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had just uncovered something significant. Mr. Whitmore, I'm denying your motion for emergency relief. Furthermore, I'm ordering copies of these financial documents to be forwarded to the appropriate regulatory authorities for investigation. This case is dismissed with prejudice. As the courtroom emptied, I remained seated while my family filed out in stunned silence. The reporters moved quickly toward the exit, probably eager to research the public records that would now be available about Vale Industries' business practices. Rebecca leaned over and spoke quietly. That went better than expected. It went exactly as expected, I replied. Sterling's been playing chess with checkers pieces for so long he forgot that other people might actually understand the game. We walked out through the side exit, avoiding the cluster of family members and attorneys on the front steps. But as we reached my car, Sterling appeared. Lloyd, he said, his voice carrying a note I'd never heard before, something that might have been desperation. We need to talk. I looked at this man who had raised me, employed me, and discarded me when I became inconvenient. No, we don't. You're destroying everything I built. I'm not destroying anything. I'm just not fixing it anymore. He stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to recognize the quiet son he thought he could control. "What do you want?" "I want what I've always wanted," I said. "To build something that lasts. To work with competent people who value integrity over image. To create systems that actually function instead of just looking impressive. And if that means destroying your family?" I got into my car and rolled down the window. "You destroyed this family the night you decided I was superfluous. I'm just cleaning up the mess." As I drove away, I saw Sterling standing alone in the courthouse parking lot, probably beginning to understand that his son had never been his employee. I had always been his competition. 6 months later, I stood in the boardroom of what had once been Vale Industries, now restructured as Axiom Enterprises. The mahogany table was the same, but everything else had changed. Instead of family members who had treated competence as a threat, I was surrounded by professionals who understood that sustainable success required substance over style. The transformation hadn't been quick or easy, but it had been inevitable once the regulatory investigations began. Sterling and Austin's creative accounting practices had unraveled under federal scrutiny, revealing a pattern of environmental violations, labor abuses, and securities fraud that dated back nearly a decade. What they'd thought were clever ways to maximize profits had actually been systematic crimes that my automated reporting systems had been unknowingly documenting. The EPA fines alone had been enough to force Vale Industries into bankruptcy. The criminal charges that followed had sealed their fate. But Augustus's competency clauses had provided a legal pathway for the business to survive under new leadership, specifically, under the leadership of the family member who actually understood how modern businesses functioned. The court-appointed trustee had transferred operational control to me within 60 days of the regulatory findings, recognizing that I was the only person with both the technical expertise and the legal standing to rebuild the company. "The quarterly reports look strong," said Dr. Amanda Reyes, my new chief operating officer. She was a former MIT professor who specialized in organizational efficiency, the kind of person who cared more about results than relationships. "Client retention is up 40% since we implemented the transparency protocols." "What about the new environmental compliance systems?" I asked. "Fully operational," replied Edison Webb, my head of regulatory affairs. "We're now exceeding EPA standards by 20%, and the automated monitoring systems are generating real-time compliance reports that have eliminated any possibility of violations." This was what competent leadership looked like: professionals who understood their roles, systems that actually functioned, and business practices that created value instead of hiding problems. The irony wasn't lost on me that the family business was more profitable and more efficient than it had ever been under family leadership. Without Sterling's ego-driven expansion projects and Austin's flashy but ultimately unproductive initiatives, we had been able to focus on what actually mattered: providing excellent service to clients while maintaining ethical business practices. But the most satisfying change was cultural. Instead of family dynamics that rewarded appearance over competence, we had created a merit-based organization where good ideas were valued regardless of their source. Instead of using technology to hide problems, we used it to solve them. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Trevor Hastings, heard through Janet that the business is doing well. Still interested in that collaboration we discussed." I deleted the message without responding. Trevor represented everything I had left behind: the world of opportunistic networking, transactional relationships, and the assumption that every success was somehow available for others to exploit. Janet herself had tried to reconnect 3 times since the court hearing made my actual financial position public. Her messages had evolved from casual inquiries about my new venture, to increasingly direct suggestions that we should discuss our future, now that my circumstances had changed. I had responded to none of them. Some betrayals create permanent boundaries, and I had learned that forgiveness wasn't always the appropriate response to deliberate cruelty. Janet had made her choice based on her assessment of my worth, and that assessment had revealed something fundamental about her character that no amount of changed circumstances could alter. Sterling and Austin had faced different consequences. Sterling was serving an 18-month federal sentence for securities fraud, while Austin had accepted a plea agreement that included 5 years of probation and permanent exclusion from any leadership role in publicly traded companies. Their reputations in the business community were destroyed, their personal finances devastated by legal fees and restitution payments. But perhaps the harshest punishment was that they had to watch me succeed using the same assets they had dismissed as worthless. Every news article about Axiom Enterprises' growth, every industry award for innovation or ethical business practices, every client testimonial about our superior service, It all served as a reminder of the opportunity they had destroyed through their own arrogance. My mother had tried to rebuild bridges, inviting me to family dinners where I would be the only family member not facing criminal charges or personal bankruptcy. I had declined politely but firmly. The Vale family had revealed its true nature during that final dinner, and I was no longer interested in pretending those revelations could be overlooked. Instead, I had built new relationships based on mutual respect and shared values. Dr. Reyes had become not just a business partner but a genuine friend. Edison Webb and I discovered a shared passion for sailing, leading to weekend trips that combined relaxation with strategic planning. My employees had become colleagues in the truest sense, people I trusted, people who trusted me, people who understood that successful businesses were built on competence rather than connections. The Cape Cod house had been transformed from a refuge into a retreat, a place where I could think strategically without the noise of daily operations, where I could plan the next phase of Axiom Enterprises' growth, where I could simply enjoy the satisfaction of building something sustainable. On this particular evening, I stood on the deck watching the sunset paint the Atlantic in shades of gold and red. The storm clouds were gone, replaced by the kind of clear sky that promised good weather ahead. Rebecca joined me with 2 glasses of wine and a legal folder that had become a tradition, our monthly review of patent applications, licensing agreements, and strategic partnerships that continue to expand Axiom's influence across multiple industries. The healthcare software division is ready to launch, she said, settling into one of the deck chairs. 3 major hospital systems are signing licensing agreements next week. And the manufacturing optimization platform? Beta testing completed successfully. We should have 12 corporate clients by year-end. I nodded, reviewing the numbers that represented not just financial success but the vindication of everything I had quietly built while my family dismissed my contributions. Axiom Enterprises was now generating more revenue than Vale Industries had ever achieved, with better profit margins, stronger client relationships, and a reputation for innovation that attracted the best talent in every field we entered. There's something else, Rebecca said, her tone shifting slightly. Sterling's attorney contacted me yesterday. He's being released next month and he wants to meet. About what? He wouldn't say specifically, but I suspect he's hoping for some kind of reconciliation now that he's had time to reflect on what happened. I thought about that for a moment, watching the waves roll steadily toward shore. Sterling Vale had spent 15 years teaching me that competence without recognition was worthless, that family loyalty was a one-way obligation, that quiet strength could be safely ignored. He had been wrong about all of it, and the consequences of being wrong had cost him everything. What did you tell his attorney? That you'd consider it, but that any meeting would need to be through proper legal channels with full documentation of the topics to be discussed. Good. But Rebecca, when he does request that meeting, the answer will be no. She nodded, unsurprised. May I ask why? I took a sip of wine and watched a sailboat move gracefully across the horizon. Someone else who understood that you had to work with natural forces rather than against them to reach your destination. Because some lessons are only valuable if they're permanent, I said finally. Sterling spent decades believing that family obligation could substitute for competence, that loyalty could excuse incompetence, that relationships mattered more than results. The only way he can truly learn from what happened is if he lives with the full consequences of those beliefs. And if he's genuinely changed? Then he'll understand why I can't take that risk. Trust, once broken at the level he broke it, doesn't get rebuilt. It gets replaced with something different, professional respect, maybe, or mutual recognition of boundaries. But not family. As darkness settled over the water, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this place. The quiet years of building parallel systems while accepting family dismissal. The night of double betrayal that had seemed like destruction but had actually been liberation. The strategic patience that had allowed me to reclaim control on my own terms rather than through emotional confrontation. Most importantly, I thought about the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge would have involved destroying my family out of hurt or anger. Justice had involved stepping back and allowing them to face the natural consequences of their choices while I built something better from the foundation they had never appreciated. They had taught me, through their betrayal, that competence was more valuable than connection, that integrity was more important than image, and that real success came from building systems that functioned regardless of who got the credit. The irony was perfect. They had spent years dismissing my contributions while unknowingly depending on my competence for their success. When they finally decided I was expendable, they discovered that their success had always been expendable without me. Now I wonder if they'd known who I really was that night, would they have dared to destroy me? The answer, I realized, was probably yes. Because people who mistake quiet competence for weakness, who confuse loyalty with submission, who assume that family obligation trumps professional integrity, those people will always make the same mistakes regardless of the consequences. They weren't evil. They were simply the kind of people who never learned that real power comes from building things that last, not from controlling people who produce lasting results. And that's why I had won. Not because I was smarter or more ruthless, but because I had always understood the difference between show business and real business. The night they destroyed me, they thought they were discarding their biggest liability. Instead, they had liberated their most valuable asset. And I had been waiting my entire life for that liberation. Have you ever experienced family members or colleagues who underestimated your contributions or took credit for your work? How did you handle discovering that people you trusted had been dismissing your value while depending on your competence? Remember, real success isn't about getting recognition for what you do. It's about building things that matter, developing skills that create value, and having the patience to let your work speak louder than your words. The most dangerous person to betray is someone who's been quietly building their own empire while you thought they were just following orders. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for your daily dose of chilling revenge tales. See you in the next video.